I think we've had a very rich and very lively morning. Tremendous amount of information, wonderful panelists, and I think a very rich discussion of what's going on both in Ukraine and vis-a-vis Ukraine's relations with the rest of the world. The organizers could think of no better way to capstone this event than to have a conversation with Zbigniew Brzezinski. Zbig's a friend and sometimes colleague for many years. I think it's fair to say that his knowledge, experience, and expertise on this part of the world is legendary, and very few people, if any, could rival him for knowledge about it, insights on it, and continuing judgments as to what goes on, not just in Ukraine, but in that entire part of the world. Zbig was just in Kiev just a few weeks ago, leading the U.S. delegation, actually, at the Chernobyl conference. He met with the president while he was there, other top officials. So he's right up to speed on this topic, bringing back the latest direct information from his most recent visit. So Zbig, it's great to have you. We thank you for coming. I'll ask you to make a few lead-off remarks. Give us your sense of where things stand in Ukraine and in U.S. policy toward Ukraine and its position in the world as a whole. Then we'll go to some questions, open up to the group, and stay until about 2:30 to wrap up the conference with the grand finale. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Fred. Good afternoon, everyone. I wasn't here during the morning session, so I want to be very careful not to repeat what was being said, and the only way I can do that, since I know it was a very good and informative discussion, to be rather general and sweeping in my comments. And I'll talk very briefly, maybe, as you suggested, for up to 10 minutes with some more general points. Let me also say that I'm delighted to be in this institute, which is so established and so respected in the city, and also to see so many people here at the session dealing with Ukraine. I think that is a statement in its own right, and it's a significant statement because it indicates that in this city there's a great deal of genuine positive interest in Ukraine, and it reflects, obviously, Ukrainians' own standing in the world. Just as a point of departure, let me make a very, very obvious observation. We are now in the 20th year of Ukrainian independence. That means that, in effect, a whole political generation has grown up in a country which is independent and which they feel it's its own. And that, I think, is a new reality. And of course, the longer it lasts, the more enduring it's going to be. During those 20 years, by and large, Ukraine's democratic record has been pretty good. Some shortcomings, we may talk about them, but by and large, pretty good. The country elected 4 presidents, every one of them in a free election. And to me, a free election is defined by the notion that one doesn't necessarily know in advance who's going to be the winner. Because we know of some other elections elsewhere where the winner is predictable, sometimes years ahead of the election, which is rather unusual. That's a very good record. But I still think, however, in spite of the 20 years and the one generation and the democratic record, that there is still a touch of ambiguity or uncertainty about Ukraine and its future status. Not a decisive ambiguity, certainly not a predetermined ambiguity, but a touch of ambiguity. Because a great deal still depends on 2 considerations. One is, how will Russia evolve, and what kind of policy will Russia pursue? And one can envisage different alternatives in Russia's near-term future, and different attitudes in that context towards Ukraine. And of course, a great deal depends also on how Ukraine conducts itself, both on the international scene and on the domestic scene. My sense is that on the international scene, there is cause for optimism, in spite of some rather pessimistic expectations regarding the consequences of Yanukovych's election. The record since his election has not been bad at all. He has been very pointed in his statements that Ukraine's unvarying priority is the European Union. Azanov has actually publicly even speculated about the year 2022 as the year of possible admission for Ukraine in the European Union. That may be a touch optimistic, but still the very fact that this is upfront, I think, indicates an attitude which on the whole is encouraging. What is somewhat less encouraging is the domestic political scene, and particularly in the area of democratic freedoms, constitutionality, legality, and so forth. One has a feeling that there is the risk of political repression. I think it would be highly premature to suggest that repression is the reality, but there are some events evolving, of which we all know, which could have cumulatively the effect of creating a politically repressive atmosphere. And that, of course, if it were coupled with a Russian policy which would be more assertive, more focused on erasing what still many in the Russian elite cannot believe is an enduring reality, then the effects cumulatively could be more serious. Nonetheless, I think insofar as foreign policy is concerned, one has the sense that the Ukrainians have made it rather clear, in spite of some of the initial concessions they made to their big neighbor, that they are determined to preserve their statehood and that they see their future increasingly in the European context, and have been willing to continue with efforts to consolidate the openings to the West, to enlarge them, and to move them forward. And this is already generating some reactions, actually, in Russia, which in a way are a testimonial to that reality. Not only is the invariable priority of Ukraine movement to the European Union, but it is also a matter of actually pursuing activities which in some respects reflect that. I was just reading a few days ago an article in Kommersant, which some of you may have read, which deals with both the Russian reaction and the Ukrainian counter-reaction to Ukraine's decision to participate in the Sea Breeze 2011 exercise, which brings into the Black Sea for joint maneuvers with the Ukrainian Navy USS Monterey, which is a missile, I forget whether it's a frigate or a cruiser, but anyway, it's a potent American weapon system. And this brought a reaction from the Russian Foreign Ministry to the following effect, quote, appearance of elements of the United States strategic infrastructure near the Russian border and reconnaissance in the Black Sea are threats to Russian security. The Ukrainian Foreign Ministry then responded that it perceives no potential threats to any country in the region on account of this naval exercise. Moscow then responded by saying that, according to a Russian official who was interviewed by Kommersant, that when he, I'm quoting, when he was in the opposition to Viktor Yushchenko, Yanukovych did everything to thwart NATO exercises in Ukraine. Now that he is president, he authorizes them again and in the most provocative manner possible. That actually was contributed by Konstantin Kosachev, chairman of the Duma's Committee on International Affairs. Well, that actually was not the end of it. Kommersant then goes on to report that it has obtained a classified document that Yanukovych is actually boosting cooperation with NATO. energetically and more so than Yushchenko. The document claims that in the framework of the NATO-Ukraine Commission in 2011, Ukraine is actually stepping up its cooperation with NATO to levels considerably higher than previously under Yushchenko. A Russian public official then said, the document we're talking about is a clear indication and proof that Ukraine is anything but independent in the formulation of its foreign policy. It does not mesh with its declared intention to remain out of military political blocs and to abandon the plans to integrate into NATO. I could go on, but this little flap, I think, is symptomatic of a reality which is much more complex than many of us feared, which is still uncertain in its final outcome. And much of that depends on internal developments, both in Russia and in the Ukraine. But it is also my own view that as time passes, and if the next 5 or so years lead to further consolidation of Ukrainian statehood, a sea change will occur in the Russian psyche of the type that historically occurred only after a number of decades after the Bolshevik Revolution, but quite a few decades, until about 1950s, 1960, regarding the Russian attitude towards Poland. Namely, that this is genuinely a separate country, genuinely a separate nation, with whom it is desirable to have good relations, and which nonetheless is not going to forsake its independence for the sake of unilaterally defined character of these good relations. And that brings me to my final comment, and I'll stop right there. It seems to me that if that condition prevails, something else very desirable is likely to take place. Namely, that in fact and paradoxically, the initial concentration on better relations with Russia, the avoidance of head-on conflicts with Russia, may have the paradoxical effect not only of consolidating Ukrainian independence, but of facilitating its more stable and more cooperative relationship with the West, in turn facilitating a similar movement by Russia. Because in fact, a Ukraine that is on good relations with Russia, but moving forward towards the West, is a Ukraine which is going to have a suction effect, together with the European Union, of Russia's own definition of its long-term future. So this is, in brief, how I sense the historical dynamics, and this is also one of the reasons why I attach my own personal sympathies aside enormous importance to how Ukraine evolves. I used to say that if Ukraine is suborned by Russia, which I now think is less likely, Russia again becomes an empire. But now I think even further, that if Ukraine is not suborned, Russia is much more likely to become European.
Zbig, terrific lead-off comments. I'm sure you'll get a lot of questions on the NATO aspect, the Russia aspect. But before we open for that, let me pick up on a few of the comments you made at the opening of your remarks, which go more directly to the things we were talking about in the conference this morning. The potential conflict between Ukraine's foreign policy objectives and what's going on within the country. It was suggested during part of our discussion this morning that that Ukraine may be headed toward, if it's not already at, a fundamental contradiction in policies. On the one hand, a commitment, as you said, to join Europe, whether as a full member
an aspiration.
Well, as I say, whether to join Europe as a full member or in the intermediate stage and maybe very short term, a comprehensive trade agreement of the type they're talking about now. But on the one hand, as you said, the commitment is to join Europe. On the other hand, it was argued by some folks this morning that what's going on within Ukraine, some of which you mentioned quickly, is headed in the other direction and is increasingly at odds with the values of Europe and indeed the West as a whole, and that those two seemingly different courses of European policy, of Ukrainian policy may add up to a fundamental contradiction that would wind up undercutting their basic foreign policy theme. What do you think about that? Do you think it's that severe yet, that it looks like a fundamental contradiction? And more broadly, you hinted at that already, but more broadly, what's your prediction? Will Ukraine evolve in the direction of the West, the values as well as the economic ties, or, as there are some disquieting signs, might it revert to a kind of post-Soviet kleptocracy, autocracy, et cetera, of the type that I think everybody here would be most unhappy to see?
I think that depends a great deal also on the reaction of the West, which means of the United States and of the European Union. I was struck that when Yanukovych went to visit the European Parliament, he was taken over the coals by quite a few of the European parliamentarians over this issue of domestic freedoms or potentially repression trials. The Tymoshenko trial has become a kind of symbolic definition of the problem, but it certainly isn't limited just to her at this stage. We know that the former interior minister is being held in jail. We know, for example, that in Lviv, a museum dedicated to the repression in the Soviet era has been visited by the Ukrainian Security Service, the SBU, and 16 employees of the museum were severely interrogated regarding their activities on the charge that they're divulging state secrets. So a museum dealing with Soviet repression of Ukrainian nationalism has its officials interrogated about their responsibility for divulging state secrets. That is kind of ominous. But the word ominous is the word that I use deliberately. It is ominous, but it is not generalized yet. It is not a pervasive phenomenon, but it is symptomatic of a threat. And this is why I did say initially that while on the one hand there is this positive thrust, which I think is sensible and on the whole balanced, and in keeping with the Ukrainian national interest in the realm of foreign policy, there is this other side domestically, which if then is in some fashion accompanied by or reinforced by some developments in Russia in the foreseeable future, could make the next 5 years very sticky. And I don't think we're yet at a stage in which we can categorically assert that Ukrainian national statehood is a reality that is enduring and inevitable. It is strong. I think there's a whole new generation of Ukrainians who strongly believe in it. I think every passing year consolidates that. I think even within what was simplistically defined as the pro-Russian orientation in the elite, there is a mood, once that pro-Russian elite got into power, that this is ours, and we're not going to be letting someone else dictate it to us or share it with us. This is ours. A little bit, if I had to compare the mood, as I sense it from my knowledge of that part of the world, within this elite, I think it's a little bit like Gierek in Poland in the latter phases of the Soviet bloc. Gierek was, of course, subordinated in some sense to Moscow, but he certainly was not keen on becoming the 18th Republic. He certainly was quite clear in wanting to preserve the degree of independence he felt he was entitled to, and to enlarge it, and to consolidate it. And he was quite determined to make domestic decisions on his own, because that was the instinct, not only of him, but of his elite. I think this sort of Yanukovych orientation is evolving in the same direction, and clumsiness by the Russians on this issue actually helps that transformation, but also vigilance on the part of the West. And I think the West has to be very clear in emphasizing the issue that you raised, that I very briefly also raised when I was in Kiev, namely that the domestic political scene defines Ukraine to us almost as much as Ukraine's external posture. And the two are interrelated. And I think this point of view is very strong in Europe. I think it is also held very strongly by Ukraine's immediate neighbors to the east, who are the friendliest towards Ukraine, particularly the Poles, because they share the conviction that democracy within is the safest and most promising way of consolidating genuine independence. So I think this is a view that we all share, and which is not an anti-Ukrainian view, which is not an anti-Russian view, because I do want to emphasize that much of what happens in Ukraine pertains to Russia, and that Ukraine can be in the forefront of a fundamental change in the East-West relationship.
Zbig, just to carry that to one more step, there were also a lot of comments this morning about the relatively passive stance that the U.S. has taken toward Ukraine in the recent past. If you were National Security Advisor now, as you were in the past, what would you be doing about it? What would be your suggested steps for U.S. policy changes now to try to promote the positive course that you're espousing and I think we would all like to see?
I think I'd rather not answer that question.
I've never known you to cop out.
I think there's a practical reason for the answer.
Okay. With that, I'll open the floor to questions and comments. I'll ask you to either go to the mic or use one of the traveling mics, identify yourself, and fire away. Gentleman in the front.
My name is Mubayin Altan, Crimean Tatar Research and Information Center. Professor Brzezinski, several months ago you met with our Crimean Tatar leader Mustafa Dzhemilev, and I'm sure he briefed you on the status of the Crimean Tatars in Crimea. I asked this question to a deputy foreign minister this morning, but I would like to ask you also. Given the Russian influence in Crimea, do you think that Ukraine has enough leverage, enough control of Crimea to resolve the Crimean Tatar problem? Does Ukraine have the political will to resolve the Crimean Tatar problem?
I think the honest answer is I don't know. I think that is the honest answer. I think there's a predisposition among many Ukrainians to try to resolve this problem, but whether they have sufficient political will, which would include having to antagonize the Russian-speaking population in Crimea, but also quite a few of the Ukrainians in Crimea, that this may be, in the initial phase, too much, some of them, to undertake. Nonetheless, I do have a sense that there is a growing consensus in Ukraine that the era of injustice must not only be forgotten, but to the extent possible, corrective measures within practical limits have to be undertaken. And this is a process which has taken place in Central Europe over the last 20 years. And in every case, it's terribly difficult because correcting the past often means also imposing some consequences for people who are not directly responsible for what happened in the past, but were the indirect beneficiaries of what happened in the past. And that vastly complicates the resolution of such issues.
Yes.
Good afternoon. Atul Singh, founder and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer, a new journal on global issues we launched last week. My question is this. You said, correct me if I'm wrong, that internal factors in Ukraine and Russia will interplay with each other. Was that a comment you did make, or am I misconstruing you?
You're essentially correct.
Okay. So I understand internal factors in Russia having an impact on Ukraine because of size, because of other factors. Russia can interfere in Ukraine in a deliberate and tangible way. How do you see internal factors in Ukraine playing out in Russia? If you could expand on that, that'd be very kind.
Well, I can expand on it by citing what I once said that historically, Ukraine, the ancient Rus, is Russia's older brother.
Yeah, correct.
In Russian historiography, the Russians like to say that the Russians are the older brother of the Ukrainians. But when one speaks historically,
Yeah.
that's not the case. But also when one speaks politically, it's not the case. Because the performance of independent Ukraine politically over the last 20 years has been more mature than Russian performance. In that sense, the Ukrainians are also the older brothers of the nascent democracy in Russia. They're providing an example that in the post-Soviet context, in which there hasn't been, for a very long time, if ever, an institutionalized democratic tradition, it is possible to nurture democracy and to consistently practice it. And that's something of which the Ukrainians ought to be very proud. And if they're proud of it, they ought to be especially alert to the negative consequences of political repression. And political repression can be direct or it can be indirect. It can be excused by other allegations. But if the effect is political repression psychologically and politically, it is political repression. And I think on that issue, it is in Ukraine's own interest to be unambiguous in drawing the line and in rejecting the settling of political scores by repression or intimidation.
Thank you.
Yes.
My name is Irena Chalupa. I work for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. It sounds to me, Dr. Brzezinski, that you want Ukraine to save Russia from itself or from its evil sort of deeds and intentions. I would like to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit. How can we help them?
Well, I just did, I think, in part in the last answer. But I don't argue that Ukraine is going to save Russia. I do make the argument that Ukraine can help Russia save itself. It's a subtle difference, but sometimes subtlety is the essence of a point.
Thank you. Tatiana Koprovich, Voice of America. During this conference and in your speech, you were talking mostly about the internal developments in Ukraine, but what is about external developments in the world around Ukraine? For example, such trends as U.S. is withdrawing from Afghanistan and Iraq, hence is becoming less dependent on Russia for passage of troops, maybe some other trends which is going on globally. In other words, is it a good time for development of U.S.-Ukrainian relationship? Is it a good timing? Is it a good situation externally?
I would say on the whole it is, because the trends you talk about all reflect the decline in the homogeneity of blocs or coalitions or entities. And some of that decline is even negative. For example, I personally regret the fact that Europe is becoming less homogeneous politically than it could be or should be by now. But nonetheless, in that context, by and large, it creates more openings for individual countries which have a sense of national pride, which have a sense of their potential regional role. And let's face it, Ukraine is an important European country. After Russia, it is the largest country territorially in Europe. And it is a country of 45 million people or so. So it is a country that has every potential reason and motive to assert as much of its autonomy and independence. And I use the word autonomy because every country, to some extent, has to take into account other countries' interests. And in doing so, contributes in a way to a more healthy environment. I think the fact that right now there's also an improvement in the American-Russian relationship is in that sense felicitous. The fact that the Poles are seeking reconciliation with the Russians and the Russians are seeking reconciliation with the Poles, even though it's going rather with difficulty, but it is moving forward, is again a good symptom. I think the fact of the Ukrainian-Polish reconciliation is much more a reality than Russian-Polish reconciliation. That too enlarges Ukrainian options. I would think that if I were a Ukrainian, I would be very interested in developing much closer relations with Turkey. which is playing an increasingly important regional role. And it makes sense for the Ukrainians, who geographically have had all sorts of connections across the Black Sea, to have a closer relationship with Turkey. So intelligent, creative diplomacy can be, I think, very usefully applied in this setting as you described it.
On the improved relation between Ukraine and Poland, I'm wearing my Euro 2012 pin, which underlines everybody's hopes that we will have a successful Euro Cup next year, hosted by the two countries together, but a symbol of the cooperation.
Well, I could be wearing my boutonniere here, the Ukrainian decoration that I received, which I'm prepared to triangulate. I got it as an American official, but given my name, probably most Ukrainians suspect I'm also in part Polish.
They might. Next question.
Bill Mikhail, George Washington University. Dr. Brzezinski, how does Belarus figure in the Ukrainian stakes of foreign policy, considering the strained relationship between Belarus and Moscow recently?
Well, it's a messy picture, quite clearly, because of the messy political situation in Belarus. It's a bizarre situation in many respects, because on the one hand, it's not maybe so much Belarus as President Lukashenko, who is asserting his autonomy by repressing his country. And it's, I don't think, a long-term constructive solution. But from the Ukraine point of view, I would guess it's an issue that the Ukrainians must be watching carefully, but probably with prudent self-restraint insofar as any direct involvement is concerned. They're really not in a position to either affect what happens in Belarus, nor significantly to affect what happens between Belarus and Russia. So in that sense, there's more of a responsibility resting on the European Union, and particularly on that cluster of countries closer to the east, which includes not only countries immediately on the border, such as Poland, Lithuania, the Baltics more generally, but for example, Sweden, which is taking a very active interest in the Belarusian problem. And I think that is probably a sensible division of labor.
Zbig, since Belarus has come up, and I don't know if you've gotten into this aspect of it, but there was some discussion this morning of the new customs union that Russia has been forging with Belarus and Kazakhstan, and whether Ukraine, common view this morning was Ukraine was not thinking of becoming a member, but finding some association with that grouping, and how that would relate to their focus on joining the European Union, common market, maybe the EU itself over time. Any observations on whether you think that would create a major tension, or again add to the appearance of possible inconsistency that would derail the main objective?
I'm not enough of an expert to give you, Fred, a kind of clear-cut answer, so let me merely say this. I think the EU ought to watch that very carefully and to be really quite strict in its application of its own perception of the reality involved. In other words, I think it would be unwise for the EU to sort of try to split the difference, accommodate, if in fact it thinks that some of these special arrangements are being contemplated, in fact do injustice, do violate the basic premises of closer Ukraine-EU relationship. I think if they feel that way, they ought to draw the line way ahead in the game, because otherwise it becomes a sliding platform and one can then go too far and in the end lose the ball game. That is to say, really forfeit the opportunity of becoming associated with the EU.
James?
James Sher. I don't have a question. I really want to support and re-emphasize the fundamental point you made about the equation between Ukraine and Russia. If Ukrainians, who are seen in the Russian mind as a branch of the Russian people, are able to adopt the standards and values of the European Union and succeed at European integration, then this sends a message not only to the Russian elite, but to ordinary Russians, which is revolutionary, because it demolishes the view that there is some distinctive East Slavic way of development and that we cannot do this, and exposes the fact that the problem is one instead of policy, political systems, and institutions. So I think this is an extremely valuable point, but I trust you would agree it still has to happen. And whatever might happen, I think a lot of us were quite right to emphasize this morning why it isn't happening yet. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I obviously agree with what you said. I would merely reiterate the point I made earlier. I think the next 5 years are going to be quite critical. I think the trend is more positive than one would have expected. I think the inclination of the Ukrainians to pursue their own nationhood in a manner of their choice and through an association with Europe has some vitality, but there are some contradictions between external policy and domestic policy in Ukraine, which could become ominous if the latter became the dominant. And also there is some uncertainty as to what kind of a Russia we're going to have in the near future. I think in the long run, I'm personally convinced that Russia doesn't have a choice. In the long run, Russia does not have a choice. But there are lots of important Russians who are in a much better position to influence what Russia does than I, who have a different view. And I think they may be tempted in the near future to still pursue a game which is partially nostalgia, which is partially great power chauvinism, which is partially false pride, which is partially an underestimation of the dangers that Russia faces domestically and internationally, and therefore pursue a policy that could be negative in its essence. And that could, combined with a repressive balance in Ukraine, have rather ominous consequences for Ukraine.
Let me ask two related questions, Big, that also came up prominently in the discussion this morning. There was a lot of commentary, of course, about corruption in Ukraine, but one school of thought argued that corruption was really more a symptom of a concentration of power within the country than a problem per se. And the question there is, do you see a trend toward increased concentration of power within the country? And if so, how much does that add to the possible ominous outcome? Related to that, there was an argument from some folks this morning that the concentration of power that seems to be occurring is due to some fundamental flaws in the Ukrainian political and even constitutional system, a lack of checks and balances within the system of government that has evolved over these 20 years, so that there's an absence of the kind of competing power centers that would be normal in a society headed toward democracy, and therefore require some rather fundamental changes in the system of government that we're seeing in Ukraine before it can really get on track. You are an eminent and extremely close student of the evolution of other post-communist societies, including on variables of that type. Share with us your assessment of where Ukraine stands on those variables, what maybe it could learn from the evolution of other post-communist transformations, and kind of what course might it chart to try to take the next step in the evolution toward a democratic system?
Well, that's a very complex issue, and I'm not sure I have any sort of grand theory or remedy to offer. I do have one point to make, however. The Ukrainian corruption is not Ukrainian corruption. It's post-Soviet corruption. I think that's a very important point. I don't think there's anything, so to speak, culturally typical about Ukrainian corruption. As I don't think is any corruption is culturally Russian. It's the cumulative effect of a system that over time bred corruption when it shifted from fanaticism to self-interest, and fanaticism was the first phase of the Bolshevik Revolution, and then after a while it became self-interest. And that corruption in turn also inherited some of the corruption of the Tsarist era. We're dealing with a society of 45 million people, which for the last hundreds and hundreds of years was part of a larger entity in which certain patterns of conduct were institutionalized and became pervasive. What I think is more specific to our time is that in this setting, not of Ukrainian corruption, but of post-Soviet corruption, in Ukraine, part of the elite that can be viewed as particularly susceptible to corruption, and it is usually identified, Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, has the attitude, well, we have the right to steal in Kiev, and not those guys in Moscow, who had the right for centuries. But that doesn't make it a Ukrainian corruption. It merely makes it like a gang warfare. This is my sphere and this is your sphere. And the guys in Moscow say, well, we don't want you to be in a separate sphere. We would like you to be back. And the guys over there say, no, this is ours. And then nationalism begins to enter it. And as nationalism begins to enter into it, you begin to play the international game. As you begin to play the international game, international standards begin to flow in. And in a lesser degree, in a much lesser degree, that's been the experience of Central Europe also. Their corruption, yes, was probably more their own, but it was also the product of, 40, 50 years of Soviet control. And then, since it was shorter and briefer and there was more nationalism, it was somewhat easier to get rid of, but not yet entirely. Look at the Czech Republic, which had a great democratic tradition ever since 1919. It is probably much more corrupt today than Poland. The Poles are much more nationalistic, though. So maybe some of their anti-corruption attitude is precisely to show they're different, less corrupt. Well, I'm, of course, joking partially, but there may be something to that, kind of a sense of we're going to show. We're going to be the success story in this part of the region. Well, if Poland can be the success story in Central Europe, Ukraine can be the success story in the former Soviet Union.
Yes.
Rich Koslerich, former U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan and now at George Mason University. Dr. Brzezinski, you mentioned Turkey-Ukrainian connections geographically, but as I thought about it, they share a couple of other things in common as well. One being transit hubs for energy, both from Russia and certainly in the case of Turkey, from the Caspian region into Europe. Secondly, they both share the status of being the two major European countries outside of the EU who have varying degrees of prospects, some of which we talked this morning about in Ukraine's case of joining the EU. But maybe you could talk a little bit about Turkey's role in this whole complex of issues that we're looking at, because of the shifts that have obviously gone on in terms of Turkey's own development, but now developments elsewhere in the greater Middle East. Sorry, Fred, I'm hijacking the meeting to get us off in a different direction, but since you raised it, Dr. Brzezinski, I'd appreciate your views.
Well, you have every reason to raise it because you have done so much to make sure that Azerbaijan and so forth are successful. And you make a very important point. I think Turkey is an interesting example of how an intelligent foreign policy, which involves a great deal of accommodation with the Russians and all sorts of deals which sometimes are troubling to us. For example, it complicates the Nabucco aspects, even though by and large the Turks are still more for Nabucco than for some other alternatives. It illustrates the point that it is possible to have an intelligent policy towards Russia without forsaking cool-headed national interest in terms of the longer run. Because the Turks at the same time are helping, in effect, without being boisterous about it, to consolidate the independence of Azerbaijan and of Georgia, and thereby making it possible for Europe to have alternative access to the Caspian and beyond. And probably before too long, Turkmeni energy will be flowing via Azerbaijan and Georgia and Turkey to Europe. And in a sense, Ukraine has a similar interest. And there's no doubt that at some point, from the Ukraine point of view, some sort of enhanced energy relationship with those countries is in Ukraine's interest. Diversification is always a good idea for any country that wishes to have the greatest degree of choice for itself and therefore independence. So I think here is another dimension of the potential Ukrainian-Turkish relationship that is beneficial, in fact, to both. I also don't think it's entirely an accident, although that reflected a very specific policy choice which would not be appropriate anymore, but which was nonetheless an important signal that Ukraine was deeply engaged in helping Georgia resist Russia. And that, in a way, was a signal of a kind of an instinctive reaction which reflects a realization that Ukrainian interests have to be seen in a broad perspective and not purely in a bilateral framework, that is to say, of their relationship with Russia. That is already, I think, being changed precisely by the importance attached to a parallel and increasingly important relationship with the EU, and therefore with some of the individual countries of the EU.
Zbig, since the Turkey analogies come up, put yourself in Brussels for a moment and think of yourself as the National Security Advisor or the Foreign Minister of the EU. Would you be more forthcoming in offering to Ukraine eventual membership as part of the attraction to resolve any dilemmas they have in the Western direction and hold out that very major prize, which seemingly Ukraine would like, but so far at least has not really been offered?
Well, it hasn't been offered, but it hasn't been denied either. I think the position of the EU, and correct me if I'm misstating it, is that the relationship has to be developed, and it's a dynamic relationship. So presumably, it is something that is moving towards something, and ultimately, especially since the Ukrainians are emphasizing that that is their vector, it means membership in the EU. But to answer your question more specifically, I would say absolutely. I mean, I would favor saying to the Ukrainians, and in fact, I think it's kind of implicit, but maybe explicit would be preferable. Anytime you want to be members, we want you to be a member. But you have to meet all of the conditions, all of the chapters. I don't think there ought to be any sort of special leeway for individual countries. The standards for you are lower than for that country, and they're higher for that country than for that country. No, that applies to Ukraine. It certainly applies to Turkey. Though here I think the problem is that the Europeans are dragging their feet on the chapters, not the Turks. With the Ukrainians, some of the reservations that have been expressed, particularly by the French and the Germans, who have discovered all of a sudden a very intense passion for the traditions of Christianity and so forth as grounds for excluding perhaps the Turks, would not be applicable to the Ukrainians because they too are Christians. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, just a final question, since we're moving geographically and with the rise of the People's Republic as a global force in international relations. The recent visit of Hu Jintao and Yanukovych's visit to Beijing signal, I think, a reanimation of that relationship. How do you see that relationship playing out? What do you see China's interests in the geopolitical interests in Ukraine vis-a-vis its broader relationship with Russia? And how do you see it evolving in the coming decade or so?
You know, at this stage, I don't think China has a geopolitical interest in Ukraine. China has a geopolitical interest in Kazakhstan. But I think it has an economic interest in Ukraine. And of course, over time, that can become a political and geopolitical interest. But at this stage, I think China is rather deliberately enhancing its access to Central Asia, exploiting the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which the Russians initiated, thinking that it would limit the independence of Central Asia, and are belatedly discovering that it has opened the doors to Central Asia to China. And I think they rue the day when they made that initiative. And the Chinese are playing that extremely well, both economically and geopolitically. With Ukraine, I think they are simply taking advantage of the fact that Ukraine needs markets, China wants markets. I wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese were very interested in helping the Ukrainians to develop their agriculture, not out of charity, but out of self-interest. And I think that there might be a very meaningful meshing of respective economic interests. And that, in turn, of course, has all sorts of political consequences, which will then grow. And in that respect, for example, I think Ukraine probably is more interesting to China than Poland, even though, of course, the EU is infinitely more important as a whole, but Poland is only one of 6 more important countries in the EU. So I think the Russian move towards Ukraine is a sensible one. I think the Ukrainians are sensible in taking advantage of it. My guess is that at this stage, the Russians are not worried about it politically, whereas my sense is that with some justification, they're becoming worried about what is happening in Central Asia.
Zbig, maybe final question. We've talked about Europe's attitude toward Ukraine, China a little bit, Russia a lot, US a little. A topic that came up again in our discussions this morning: how much can external influence, pressure, encouragement affect the outcome of the internal debates in Ukraine? Every country is somewhat susceptible to outside influences, but it differs a lot from country to country, from time to time. Given this possible tension we talked about, the internal evolution in a potentially ominous direction versus laudable external goals, what's your sense as to how much the outside situation and treaties may, at the end of the day, affect what happens within Ukraine itself?
Well, that depends to some extent on the level of priority the sort of dominant political class in Ukraine assigns to the enhancement and preservation of independent statehood. And it's hard to judge, but I think on balance, by virtue of being that elite, they have to assign some relatively high importance to it. And in that sense, the position of the United States and of the EU is obviously quite important, even though maybe not as immediately impacting as, of course, of Russia. But, of course, it has limits. But there's something else which is peculiar here, which I think is worth mentioning. In some respects, there is a parallel here between Ukraine and Israel. That is to say, Israel has a certain inherent strategic orientation. But if the American Jewish community were to disassociate itself in some significant fashion with a prevailing Israeli government, right now, for example, a very conservative one, very right-wing one, it would have a significant impact on Israel's own policy. I suspect that the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada and in the United States is not insignificant in that respect. It's not maybe as decisive as the Jewish community would be vis-a-vis Israel, but it's not insignificant. Because, for one thing, the whole notion of Ukrainian independent statehood was nurtured for decades outside of Ukraine, in the diaspora. And that is where the spirit was preserved, and that was in turn nurtured, particularly the Ukrainians in Western Ukraine, then increasingly in Central Ukraine, and so forth. And that is an additional factor which plays a role here. So I think since that diaspora is located in the Western Hemisphere, in the United States, in the Atlantic community, it enhances to some degree the American role. I don't want to overplay this. It's not quite on the same level as, let's say, the importance of the Jewish community to the internal outlook of Israel, but it is of some importance, more so than in the case of many other countries. And I think all of that, in my judgment, progressively reinforces the durability of what has existed for 20 years. 20 years is a long time in the psychology of a lot of people, because 20 years shapes basically the outlook of anyone in Ukraine who was at least 10 to 15 years old when the country became independent. So that's an increasingly significant number. And then, of course, all the other factors we talked about come into play. But all of them cumulatively, in my judgment, I think allow one some kind of responsible, controlled optimism regarding the prospects, with clarity about our own attitude towards this, positive and negative, and no hesitation in being explicit about it, in talking to those that we value in Ukraine, given the fact that we think a Ukraine that is genuinely self-defined and independent can help Europe be a much healthier place in that larger dimension to which I made reference in my earlier comments.
Zbig, thank you enormously for such a superb conclusion to our conference. In wrapping it up, I want to again very deeply thank all of the participants in the panels this morning. Some of you came from a long way for it. We deeply appreciate that. I particularly want to thank our co-hosts and organizers, Steve Pfeiffer from Brookings, Damon Wilson from the Atlantic Council, my colleague Anders Ostlund, who put it together for us at the Peterson Institute. We hope this made achieve the objective of the exercise, adding to awareness of what's going on in Ukraine, trying to demonstrate U.S. interest in the issue, and trying to think of some constructive ways to go about it. So thanks to all. I'm sure we'll be continuing to address this in the future, but I greatly appreciate your being with us today. Meeting adjourned. Good luck to all. Thank you.